live?
Joseph, Shervin is sending him. There we go.
Okay. Hey, welcome everyone to today's Friday Lunch and Learn at Improving, and we'll go ahead and get started today. We've got a nice session planned for everyone. So today, my name is Joe Brinkman, and I'm going to be talking today about automating your builds and deployment pipelines with Azure DevOps. And so just a little bit about me. I've done a lot of different things in the software industry over the years, both hardware and software. Been Microsoft, recognized by Microsoft in multiple areas. So just had a 30-year plus career building software. And what I'm going to talk about today is really sort of the culmination of that and some of my experiences. So before we dive into starting to talk about builds and deployments and everything, you know, I always like to preface my talks by understanding why this is important. Like, what is it about this talk, or what is it that, you know, I hope you take away from this? And so I'm gonna spend the first couple of minutes here just diving into that a little bit and going through sort of why I think this is an important topic for software developers and for organizations that are building software. So Steve Jobs, ultimate product man, you know, had a quote that said, "Quality is more important than quantity." It's not about, you know, one home run or whatever. Everything he did at Apple, everything he did when he was at Pixar and at Next and all these other places, was really focused on building the highest quality product that he could. It didn't matter whether it's a video or a piece of software or a computer, right? All of those things, it was all about building that quality. And you see that over and over and over again from his tenure and his career. Similarly, if you look at companies like Ford, who even through the 70s and 80s, you know, quality is job one, right? That was their tagline, that was their marketing line that they went to market with, right? These organizations recognize that a fundamental aspect of building products in any endeavor, whether it's hardware, building cars, whether it's building computers, building software, is all about delivering value to the customer, and the factor by which you deliver value is delivering things of quality. It doesn't matter if I give you 20 features if 10 of them are broken, right? What matters is those 10 that are working perfectly, and you can get rid of the other 10 and still have a probably better product result. So you're seeing this from the industry and seeing this from these various companies where quality is what they're focused on. They're not focused on the product per se, but the quality of that product is an important factor. And where you see the flip side of that, where you see companies that maybe have not paid as much attention to quality, we've seen in the news this last year where Boeing, once you know, well regarded in the aerospace industry, you know, this failure to pay attention to quality can have disastrous results, right? And you go and you dig into the case studies around what happened at Boeing, and what you find is that the software that was used to control those planes didn't go all of those quality checks that they ordinarily would have, or that other teams at Boeing might have done, right? So you see sort of these companies and how their approaches to software quality or to quality overall kind of impacts them and the way they're perceived in the marketplace, both positively and negatively. One of the fundamental aspects, every time you look at how do companies approach building quality products, how do we approach building quality software, like what is it, what is that key magical thing that goes from being like, maybe it's going to be good or maybe it's not going to be good? How do we improve on that? How do we ensure or or increase our likelihood that we're going to deliver quality products, and that's by following quality processes, right? Quality does not just magically appear at the end of the development cycle because we ran a bunch of tests on our software. Quality is built in from the very processes that we use to deliver software. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, organizations like the Department of Defense, Carnegie Mellon, NASA, and many, many others studied this in depth. And what they found was that organizations were following rigorous processes, or any processes that were documented, repeatable, that where you could see exactly what the steps were, and you could see where they had incrementally followed those steps. Organizations that did that delivered consistently better quality software. And that's important when you're the Department of Defense and you're deploying missiles or aerospace systems, or you're NASA and you're sending people to the moon, or you're a little pharmaceutical company who's building some biomedical device that has to deliver the right dosage at the right time period, right? All of these things matter. And where we see failures in the industry, you can generally trace it back to a failure in process. So when we talk about why, why are we automating builds? Why does Azure DevOps matter, right? It comes back to this sense of quality, and it comes back to this fundamental understanding that having good processes and repeatable processes allow you to build higher quality software. So if we look at and dive down into the software space itself and kind of look at where the software industry has been over the last 50 years, 60 years, we developed, and this culminated probably in the 80s and 90s, and even a little bit into the 2000s, this idea of the software development lifecycle, right? Like this goes back pretty early in computer science, but we started formalizing it more as we got into the 70s and 80s. And there's a couple of steps here, and it's not really important, these steps, because every diagram that I've seen on this sort of changes, you add a step or remove a step. The important thing to mention here is the fact that it's not get some requirements, build a product, test the product and deliver it, and we're done, right? When we talk about software development, we're really talking about an iterative process. It doesn't matter what methodology you're using, whether it's waterfall, running RAD or JAD, or whether you're doing Agile or XP, Scrum, what have you. All of those methodologies and all of those approaches to software development still follow this iterative cycle. The only question might be a difference in tooling, or a difference in the way that they approach requirements, or a difference in the implementation details and sort of how they go about getting that. Or a difference in the length of that iteration cycle, right? If you look at one extreme on the Agile side, where you might have iterations that are as short as a week or even a couple of days for some really extreme Agile iterations, and go to the other extreme where you have things following a waterfall methodology. If you look at what that looked like in terms of NASA building space shuttles and spacecraft, where an iteration might be a couple of years long, or 3 years long, 5 years long, right? And those iterations are much longer, but they're iterations nonetheless, right? You started with a rocket, and ultimately you had at some point a space shuttle, and you go a few years further down the road and you've got some other configuration with effectively the same sort of software, right? And that's what this iteration process is about, is taking the learnings from one iteration and feeding it into the next iteration, right? So software development lifecycle, everyone who builds software today recognizes that we go through this iterative process, and we try to optimize for that as much as we can. But other than that, because part of the challenge that we have in software is that we don't live in a vacuum, right? The software development lifecycle has a partner, if you will, in the hardware space, in the operational space, right? We don't just build software and then go and build the next iteration of the software and keep doing that loop over and over again. At some point, that software that we built gets deployed to the customer. That software that we built gets packaged up and sold to hundreds of thousands of customers out in the marketplace. That software that we built gets pushed to Facebook or YouTube or whatever 2 or 3 times a day as we're updating our SaaS applications, right? So all of this development is actually feeding into an operational cycle, right? And so the output of that operations, like, hey, this thing worked well, or hey, this is not working the way we would like it to work. Those things, right, sort of play off of each other, and the output of the operation cycle feeds back into the next planning iteration for the development cycle. And we call this, and this is something that has developed over the last 10 years in a more formalized that existed well before, you know, the 2000s. We just didn't have a term for it or really codify it the way we do today. So what I'm going to focus on today, and so hopefully that gives you a framework or an understanding about why the automation of, or why having these processes and where the importance is here. It's really about how do I build good quality software. And on for the rest of this talk is really talking about this transition from taking that software and actually getting it into an operational environment, building and packaging that software and releasing it into some environment, or releasing it in some form that can then be delivered to a customer in terms of packaged application. And whether you're talking about a formal product per se, like I used to build at previous organizations, right, where you would sell a license key and they would go download the software and install it, or we're talking about some of the more SaaS or website type of work that we do today, where we're actually pushing into a release environment, right? Effectively, the same methodology applies, the same sort of rules apply here. So what I'm going to start with today as we dig into the Azure side of this now, we're going to start with basically these 4 phases, these 4 steps of my process. And each of these steps can actually be broken down into much more granular detail depending on your particular application and what you're trying to accomplish. But we're going to start with these high-level ones, and we'll translate that into how that looks from a software perspective. Okay, we're going to build our the application. We're going to test it, publish it, and then release it. Right, and that gets us through effectively that build and release cycle that we have. So I'm going to focus on Azure DevOps and specifically some of the tooling within Azure DevOps. The key to note is that Azure DevOps is a really gargantuan product, and there's a lot of features and functionality even within just the build pipeline and the release pipeline portion of Azure DevOps. So I don't want you to take away from today's talk that I'm going to be doing an exhaustive talk on every bit of feature and functionality that exists in Azure DevOps. What I really want you to take away from it is that Azure DevOps actually help you deliver quality software by applying those basic fundamentals of process-driven development where you're automating as much of that process as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on just one small piece of this today, and we're going to walk through that and take a look at what that might look like. And it's going to guaranteed be baby steps. This is not going to be going into exhaustive detail on some of this stuff, but I think it should be enough to give you a flavor of how you can build on that and then dive deeper into the world of Azure DevOps or DevOps in general. Okay, so let's go ahead and shift over to our demo here. And I'm going to start with just a sample application that I've got here. This is just an application that's built in ASP .NET Core. So this is a very lightweight application, and it doesn't do anything spectacular, right? It's a plain website. I can come in here, I can run this website. We'll give it a second to spin up here. And effectively, it's just got a couple of pages in it. It's just some marketing material for my company. Let's kick over here. We'll take a look as that's coming up. Hello. There we go. Why are we not? Oh. My browser is not cooperating here. Give me just a second. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Yeah. There we go. So we've got our website is up and running. So let's go ahead and shift over into Azure DevOps now, right? And so we've got our software. We know kind of this application that we want to get into production. So we've got everything is uploaded into Azure DevOps, and we've loaded all of the software. So we've got our website, we've got our unit tests, we've got some sample pipelines we'll go into here in a minute. Now what I want to do is I want to take this software, which when I was on my desktop, right, I took this software and I built it and ran this software with Visual Studio. But now I want to put this and operationalize this and put this in an environment where I can have this build automatically for me, where every time I make a software change, this thing is automatically going to go ahead and build for me. So with that, I'm going to come over here to Azure DevOps, and I'm going to go into the pipelines area. And we can see I don't have any pipelines created already. And what I want to do, so I'm going to go ahead and create this pipeline, create a brand new pipeline. And it's going to walk me through a number of steps. But before we do that, I'm going to actually use Classic Editor, and that'll make more sense here in a couple minutes when we get to the release pipeline. So the Classic Editor is going to ask me where I want my software to, or my source code to come from. Now, out of the box, I'm going to get Git, and I could go to GitHub, and I could get Subversion and Bitbucket and all these other places. I'm just going to choose Azure Git for now, which is where I've got my software. Say ASP.NET, but in my case, I know that I actually want the .NET Core, which is what we said we were running. And what this is going to do is this is going to bring up sort of a wizard-driven approach, right? So I'm going to enter some values here. It says, hey, I'm going to run this on Ubuntu, but maybe I want to do my builds on Windows, probably more applicable for what I'm doing. It's or I could do it on Ubuntu, it wouldn't matter. It's asking me where my tests are, and then it's going to go through and do a couple of steps for me. And this is all great, right? Like I could go through, build out my pipeline, add additional tasks in here. Let's say all of these are looking fine. Maybe I want to add another task and do something else here, right? There are really hundreds and hundreds of types of tasks that I can do, whether it's running Azure Functions or Java or Jenkins or calling out to all these other systems. All of that's possible in here. But the problem with this is that the output from this is a bunch of entries in a database that lives up in the cloud, and there's very little I can do in terms of quality control on this artifact, right? If I build a new environment for the next team or for the next project, I have to come in here and I have to set up each of these things all over again. I have to define what these jobs look like or what these steps look like. And from an automation perspective, that's not really that good, right? Because I'm fundamentally breaking that automation at the very first step, which is to define the process. So that was the classic view, and we'll talk about why that's important later as we get down into the release side. But for now, we're gonna abandon that. We're gonna go ahead and create a new pipeline, and we're gonna use the new approach. And you'll see in a second why the new approach is actually better and different. And so we're going to start with a ASP.NET Core, but I don't want to target the .NET framework. I actually want to target the .NET Core framework, right? So I'm going to stay completely in .NET Core. So this is the new UI. This is the new Azure pipelines, if you will. The difference is this is a YAML file. It's a text to read and understand, and I can see what each of the steps are that are involved in building out my pipeline. So I'm going to go ahead and we're just going to accept this for now. We'll come back to this. We'll let this save. And we're just going to say this is my initial pipeline. And all this thing does is the very first step. And all it does is a build, right? It doesn't run any tests. It doesn't build any packages. It doesn't do any releases. All it does is a build. And in fact, this one's doing it on Ubuntu. So at any time, once this starts, I can come in here and I can look at this job and see how this job is progressing. And I can say, great, this looks fine. Give it 20 or 30 seconds. You can watch this as it's progressing through. And depending on what else is running in the queue or what else is competing for CPU cycles, this can go pretty quickly. We see here this one's it's just about done, probably another 5 seconds or so, and we should be wrapped up. Okay, so 35 seconds, not too bad. We built the software, it's built up in the cloud. This is not running on my machine. I did not take any CPU cycles on my machine. In fact, I could have closed this window down or not even been in this window, and it would have kept running without me or without my machine on this end, right? So that's good. But the difference here with this over the old pipeline is that now instead of having this thing that kind of lives in a database in the cloud somewhere that we don't know how it's version controlled, this is actually just a file, and I apologize, my network is doing something weird at the moment. This is just a file that lives on disk. So it actually lives as part of my repository. I'm not sure. See if I can refresh and bring Azure back up here. Let's try that again. There we go. So it's just a file. It's in my repository under Azure Pipelines. Everything looks fine, right? So this can actually, as I make changes to it, will go through all of this version control. And this will actually be a version document that I could roll back to at any point in time if I find that some change to this pipeline was breaking things for me. So let's, one of the things and that's great, and it's nice that they have this development here within the environment. Wow, this is really, Azure's really giving me fits at the moment. I'm going to shift over here to my desktop here for a minute so we can talk about this. So because it's a YAML file and it just lives inside of my Git repository, I can version it just like any other file. I can make changes to it, update it, push those changes back into the repository. And what will happen is that when that does, let's see if I can get this to actually behave now. That first line, this line here is the important part. This basically says anytime we have a change to our master branch in our Git repository, we're going to go ahead and trigger this build. And what I want to do is I'm gonna take what I've already got in my repository. I'm going to go ahead and delete this one for now. Let's delete this. I'm going to create delete the pipeline. You got to get the caps right, and we'll go ahead and delete that. And let's go ahead and create a new one. This time I'm going to create one from something that already lives in my local repository, and we'll start from there. Why is it bringing up that? Let's do this again. Create repository. Wow. Start from Azure, start from, DevOps, demo, ASP.NET Core. Yeah, it's not recognizing files that are here. Let's make sure we got all of our files. Basic pipeline. Okay, well, we'll go the opposite route here. We'll use the pipeline that they've got here. I don't know why it's not letting me. Normally, I would have an option in there in this select to select a file out of my repository, and I'm not sure why it's not giving me that option this time. But fortunately, I have this here, so I'm going to just grab this and we'll start from this way. It's always good that we've got backups of this. So I can go ahead and save that. Is basically what we had before, and this time I've changed to Windows latest, but let's do one more thing because we've already got our .NET was there, so I actually changed this, so we're going to use the .NET Publish. So this is going to do a couple of steps. This is going to build the software, and then it's going to take that software and put it in a form where ASP.NET Core can actually execute and run that software on a website or on IIS or whatever the web server is you're going to run it on, Kestrel or whatever, depending on what the operating system you run it on. So the next step that we actually want to do here is we want to do a test, right? So we want to run, like my software's got unit tests associated with the software. So I need to be able to run some unit tests along with building. So I don't want to just build it. I also want to run some unit tests of the 4-step process we were talking about before. And this is just one small example of writing tests. Like for a lot of projects I might have unit tests for the back-end code. So for a lot of projects, I might have unit tests that run for the back-end code. For other projects, I will have unit tests that run for my JavaScript. And so I might have 3 or 4 different types of unit tests that I'm running in my application. So this is just one example. So let's go ahead and save and run this pipeline. So we're going to add unit tests in there. We'll go ahead and save that. It's going to automatically run that pipeline for me. So again, remember when I defined this, and when we looked in Visual Studio, it's not picking up my current Visual Studio. Let me, not sure. There we go. Now it's at least updating. So when we run this, again, it's being based on this trigger from master, right? So that's what's determining. So when I made that change to this job, it actually triggered back its own execution. So this time we're going to run a little bit longer. We can see all of the details of exactly how our process is running. We can see where it checked out from. If I was checking out of GitHub, I would see all of the polls coming down from GitHub. Normally this can take as short as 30 seconds. In this case, we're going to end up probably about 1:30. So we'll do the build and publish, and then it's going to run some unit tests. So in this case, those unit tests, in this case, our unit tests are fairly simple, because I'm not really interested in the actual, I'm more interested in the actual running and seeing this thing execute. But again, nothing seems to be working today. So we're just waiting for this job to finish running. So we'll go ahead and move on while we wait for this job. So man, Azure is really not being kind to me today. So if we have the project, and now our project is running, we've successfully built the project, we've successfully tested the project. We can see that our tests, it ran successfully, right? So this is now we're starting to take each of those iterations of our software, of our process, and we're now starting to see those and how Azure DevOps can help us create a reusable process. So every time I check in code, what I will see is I will see another iteration in this pipeline start to run, right? And so if we look at all of the runs, so we've got one here, and as we run additional checks through here, we'll see those start to populate as well. So we've got our initial build, we've got our initial test. The next thing we need to do is go through and look at how do we take this now and start to package it up. And packaging this in .NET is actually pretty simple. And we're going to just add a little bit more to our YAML. We'll go ahead and add this publish command, and it's just going to take everything from our staging directory, which we've identified up here in step 16, and we're just going to build it as an artifact. And what an artifact is recognition that that the things that we're doing in the build pipeline are separated from what's going to happen when we go to release this into our release environments. And we may have multiple release environments that are targeted here. So we'll go ahead and save that and let that go ahead and run. And while that's running, so we can see that automatically pick that up and is starting to run. So let's see how that's going. So we'll let that go ahead and go. The next piece that we're going to want to do, so we're going to have built the process, we're going to have tested it, It's now trying to package that up and get that ready to hand over to our release process. And when we're done, when this job completes, we will see an artifact show up here. And that artifact is basically the output of that publish cycle that can be used for releasing and building our website. And so that artifact becomes an important part of the process. So do we have, I'm seeing a bunch of chat comments come across here. Do we have, are we waiting on any questions, Sherlyn?
We don't have any questions yet.
Okay, okay, perfect.
Oh wait, I do have one, I'm sorry.
So
the question we have is the YAML for the pipeline able to be modified from a wizard?
Yes, so it is YAML. You can modify it in the browser. It's just files in your repository. So you can come in here into your repository at any point, come into these, and if these are my pipeline files, right, I can come in here and edit those, make changes to them, have them re-trigger in the system, and that's all fine, right? Or I can do it in Visual Studio. As soon as I push those changes up, it'll read those and run that pipeline. So again, they're configuration items now inside of your Git repository. Okay.
Another one in a similar topic. You create the pipeline in the classic editor and then save it as a YAML file into our repo?
You can. So let's go back and talk about that a little bit. So you can't, if it's in the classic editor, you can't actually convert it straight into YAML. But what you can do is, if I were to come in here and let's create another one, and I'll show you. Let's create a new pipeline. We're going to take the classic editor. So if you have one that's in, let's say you're already running this and you're in the classic, and we'll just go ahead and choose this here. It doesn't matter what it is. We'll apply that. We're not going to actually run this, but I can, any of these steps here, I can view the YAML for that step, and then I can copy that into my YAML file. So I can actually copy the actual task here that's running. I don't need to copy the steps part. So I would copy this task, put it in my YAML file, and build it up that way. And then the agent job and the pipeline definition are just that top part, like the pipeline defines like the build specification, the pool that it's coming out of, a few other things. The sources just tells you where you're getting stuff from, right? But this, you can always get the YAML for that, okay? We're gonna let that one go, come back in, let's make sure everything built correctly, good. So we've got this, we've got our artifact is now published, and if I go look at this, the artifact is all of those compiled artifacts coming out of my application, just as you would see as if you had hit publish from Visual Studio, right? It's going to go through, compile all that down, put it in a directory for me. So now I actually have something that I could take the output of this, I could take this artifact, and I could actually deploy that now to a server. Maybe I could deploy it to my local web server, or I could deploy something in one of my data centers. So if this is all you took out of this, you would at least have a but what we want to do is go a step further than this. We don't want to just build this. We want to actually be able to deploy this into our environment. So to do that, we're going to come down here. We're going to talk about releases now. And releases are different in that they don't have this dichotomy yet of a classic pipeline versus a new pipeline. They just released YAML as a release general availability feature this spring. Prior to this, this was the only way you had for doing releases. Prior to this, you always had to use this GUI interface for building those. And again, it looks very much like what you would expect to see in the classic pipeline for the build side of the job. So we're just going to call this my development environment. And so this is a stage basically saying my software is going to go through multiple stages before I ultimately get to some endpoint. And so we're just going to call this one now, for now, development. We'll go ahead and close that. And oh my goodness. Okay, I think we're back. My network keeps dropping for some reason today, and I'm not sure why. So we're going to take that artifact that we got from the last build process, and we're going to go ahead and add that here. And we're going to say, I want this to be continuous deployment. In other words, every time we build a branch and we do a build on that master branch, I want you to go ahead and create this artifact and create a new release for the system. And then, so this is going to give me my releases. And then I'm going to say, every time we build a release, I want to push that release into this environment, into this stage. So for now, we're going to go ahead and let that, like I could do this based on artifacts. I don't need to do that at the moment. We can just say it's after release, and that should be plenty fine. And we'll go ahead and close that. And now we'll come down here and we'll actually look at the actual job. So I have this stage. I'm going to go ahead and grab out of my Azure subscription. I'm going to go ahead and grab, no, that's not the one I want. I want to grab this service connection because I've already defined everything in that service connection. Otherwise, I have to reset up a new service connection. So this just basically says I'm going to grab the app service name, an iPrincipal Windows security principal in the background for me previously, and set up this connection. So this tells me where I'm going to deploy to in terms of app services. I can define what type of agent I expect this to run on. So this release pipeline is running effectively in its own virtual machine, independent of the environment that I'm going to deploy into. Okay, and that's important when you start thinking about doing things like integration tests or UI automation tests. So all of those test scenarios, your tests will execute in the release pipeline environment against your deployment environment. Okay, so you actually, when you're in release, you have two different environments. We're talking about the release pipeline environment and your deployment environment. So in this case, we're going to use that Azure Resource Manager, and it should give me my app service name is already there. The rest of this I can just leave as is, except this one item. I want to come into my artifact and I want to say, let's grab why are we not deploy Azure App Service virtual package or folder? Yeah. Yeah, I can't do much. So normally I would be able to select an environment here, and with my network problems right now, it's not picking up those. There we go. So okay, so now I've got my location. We can go ahead and save this. And that's fine. And now everything in here is green, meaning I'm good to go on the pipeline. And I can go ahead and create a release. And as soon as I create this release, all I'm doing is saying, hey, take whatever build out there and create this release. Because I set up that pipeline right here and said after I build a release, or after a release is started, go ahead and start deploying it. Go ahead and start running these tasks that I've defined. And I could have defined many additional tasks, right? Like there's a ton of tasks, whether it's testing or deleting or building Docker images or pulling Docker images, right? All of these different things that I can use to actually start releasing into my environment. It may be things as simple as setting up integration tests as part of my pipeline. So we're going to let this go ahead and finish running, and that should actually run fairly quickly. This, unlike the build process, seems to be a little more reliable for me today. And let's go ahead and take a look at the tasks. So we want to look at this app service. So here's the app service that it deployed into. Everything there is looking good, and I should be able to go into the website and hit that service. And assuming we're going to get good network connectivity, that should come up. Wow. Something today is really chugging on the network, and I'm not sure what. So anyway, that's going to come back up, take a minute or two, whatever's happening there. So now we've got a release and everything is fine. So let's go ahead and edit this some more. Like if I was normally building out my pipeline, actually, I need to come all the way back out. I don't want to edit the release. I want to actually edit the pipeline itself, not the release, not release one. So you can actually modify the pipeline for a specific release iteration, or you can edit the master, which is what I'm doing here. So I can create additional environments, and I can say this is maybe my integration test, and it's going to set up its own environment that it can tear down afterwards. And then I'm going to set up maybe another environment. We'll just clone this. I'm going to set up, and I would go through and edit these jobs to point at the specific environments, and I would do maybe QA, and I would say, okay, that's fine. We're going to push into our QA environment, so my QA team can start executing against this. And maybe after QA okays it and integration tests have been run and everything is looking good, we're going to end up with an environment that is staging, that is ready for production, right? So now you're starting to see the nature of this. I can come in here and I can say after the previous stage, well, I don't want to just make sure that QA ran. I want to make sure that QA and my integration tests ran. And because they're integration tests, maybe some of them may be flaky tests. And I don't want a flaky test preventing me from being able to move on. Especially if you're doing things like UI automation, you'll find that it's not uncommon for a UI test to sometimes fail for a timing issue or something like that, and it's not a consistent failure, right? It's an intermittent failure, and in those cases you might say, okay, even if it's partially succeeded, I still want to be able to move into staging where we might do user acceptance tests or whatever, right? And then finally, I might do one more environment, and I might do a production environment, right? And the production environment is different than the other environments because I don't want stuff just flowing automatically into production in most cases. So I might do something like set up a gate that says, hey, give me 20 minutes or a half hour, or do some other check, right? Like some Azure monitoring on the environment before you push in here. If the environment doesn't look good, then don't do the push. Or we might look at some REST APIs, or we might look at some at the code to verify that we've got policy compliance. So those are some examples there of gates, or in some cases, and I've got one client today, they say, hey, we're not going to do any automated pushes into production. If you want something to go into production, it's going to be completely manually pushed, and we'll figure out and we'll go ahead and push that directly into production. So all of this is what the release pipeline looks like today. And this is working and it's stable and it's functional, and you can get really crazy with these pipelines, and that's great. But where you really want to be, ultimately long-term, what you want to have, again, the same way with the build pipelines, is you want the ability to be able to version control this pipeline. You want the ability to say, hey, wait a minute, we made this one change to the release pipeline, that wasn't the right change, needs to be backed out. Or I want to take this same release pipeline and move it over to this other project because that pipeline works, it's functional, I know all of the pieces are there, yeah, I'll change a couple of names, but I want this fundamentally and not recreate it and miss some setting, right? So this is where that idea of having pipelines that are defined for releases comes in. And you can actually define pipelines today using YAML. And when doing that, there are two parts of the pipeline that we haven't talked about yet, and I'll talk about one of them here. One of them is called jobs, and the other is called stages, or a stage. So before, if you looked at these earlier steps, right, we just had these things called steps. Well, there are three levels effectively in a YAML pipeline. We have stages, jobs, and steps. So what I'm showing in this file is jobs, and these jobs are individually schedulable pieces of work. So if I schedule this first piece of work, I can give that to a build agent and let it go off and work on that. I can have another build agent come in and say, hey, I want you to build my UI tests. That's a different project, completely independent of the software. And a third one might be building out my integration test suite, yet another job, completely independent. And then if I introduce this concept of stages, we're just going to talk about it briefly. So stages have a stage, right? And then I would go ahead and under each stage, now I would have certain jobs. So I would have jobs related to related to building the application, and then I would have another stage related to releasing the application, or I might have multiple stages related to releasing the application. Even within jobs and within stages, I can create dependencies between them. The one downside and where we're at today with YAML in building release pipelines is that all of the features that are available in that graphical UI pipeline for releases are not available today or fully supported in YAML. So if you're building release pipelines and you're getting quite complex, you may not be able to replicate that today in YAML. I know they're working on adding more and more features to get the YAML pipelines and the release part of that pipeline fully supporting everything that is in the release pipeline as it exists today. So hopefully that gives you an idea of why I think why I think it's critical for you to be using Azure DevOps in your development today, because it truly does take those processes that are error prone and could be not repeatable if you skipped a step and really makes them into a process that helps you deliver high quality software. With that, we've got a couple minutes left here. If we've got any questions, I do apologize tremendously for the network issues today. Hopefully we were able to show enough of the demos and we were able to get past those network issues. But if we've got any other questions, I'd be happy to open the floor for a couple of minutes to take any of those questions.
Joe, we got 3 or 4 for you today. The first one's from Dave. I'm using YAML for build pipelines, but the classic for release pipelines. My understanding is that Azure DevOps supports YAML for both. I just don't see great support for YAML on the release side. Is that coming soon or more like a few years from now?
It is coming soon. It's something that they're actively developing. They just announced it last year at Build, so it was announced at Build. They put it out in preview release, I think, in the fall timeframe last summer. It did go general availability a couple months ago, but not all of the functionality is yet supported. So I do expect, if you look at the release schedule for 2020 or what it was before all the lockdowns occurred, you could see that there was a lot of work being done to get YAML support up to handle all of the features that you traditionally have used in the classic release.
The next one is, what is the cost model for DevOps? Are you charged per pipeline?
You are not charged per pipeline. In fact, I don't know that pipelines have an independent model. I think that's part of, and I could be wrong on that. I think that's part of the basic subscription model for your Azure DevOps in total. Like you can use these pipelines even on a completely free plan, and in fact, what you're seeing here today is me running in my personal account, and right, all of this functionality exists even on my free personal account. I think there's, like, most personal accounts have like a $200 limit a month that you can get on them, that they give so that open source projects and all these other projects have access to all these tools. So
Emily asks, she wants to confirm, so if I click add from development twice and create 2 new stages, DevOps will create a parallel network? And she clarifies, my question is, how do I create a parallel network? I'm sorry.
So these tasks here, or these jobs here, these are effectively stages. Stages are, like you can see here, this is parallel work. And in fact, jobs are parallel work, or can be. They don't have to be. So if I come in here and I look at my jobs, I can actually create additional jobs within here. And a job is a unit of work that can be put on an agent, and depending on your licensing, you may have a single agent, which I'm running on a free account, so I have a single agent, but you can buy additional agents, so you can parallelize up to the number of agents that you have. Now, keep in mind that the agents are split between all of your pipelines, your build pipelines and your release pipelines. So if you have a bunch of work queued up in your build, it will affect your releases and vice versa, right? It's just how many agents do I have to actually run work. But if you define your release pipeline, like I showed you here, either you can have multiple jobs inside a single stage, or you can have multiple stages that all will be queued and run independent of each other based on how many agents you have available. Hopefully that answers. And then you can make your dependencies into the next stage, then bring those back together, right? By saying, hey, whenever both of these things are done, I want you to go ahead and start on this thing, right?
So Joe, we're at our 1 p.m. Timeline. Do you have time for a few more questions, or are we?
Yeah, I'm good for
more.
a few more. I know we had some network issues here that stopped some of this, but.
All right, thank you very much. Let me go to the next one. Do you know of any offline YAML editors that are aware of Azure tasks and schema with IntelliSense that are any good?
Yeah, so I've used, what I primarily use is Visual Studio Code. So you saw me here today with Visual Studio, and you know, that's okay. I actually like Visual Studio Code better. To me, that the YAML support in there is really pretty nice. Now, keep in mind that tasks and things within Azure DevOps are updated periodically, right? A couple of times every quarter. So the editors don't know about every task and every piece of the pipeline schema. So they may lag a little bit, but I've had pretty good success with Visual Studio Code and some there with editing the DevOps YAML pipelines.
Joe, the next one is, can this process be used for SSIS projects?
I haven't used it specifically with SSIS projects. I have used it with SQL Server database projects. So I don't honestly see any reason why there would be a problem running SSIS against it. If you went in and edited, and this is where I would definitely encourage you to get a free account on Azure and go take a look, right? Like if you look, let's see if we got database. So we've got the deployment side, which that's the DACPAC stuff. And I don't believe on the release side. And again, there's also part of this in the marketplace. There are other plugins that you can add into here to get different stuff. So, right. So if I go out to the marketplace, there's all this additional functionality that's out there. I don't know specifically about SSIS. I would be surprised if it was.
And our last question for the day, if you're starting .NET development practices in a company, would you choose Azure DevOps or GitHub?
I would choose Azure DevOps. And the reason why is because it is a more mature product from the holistic lifecycle perspective, right? Like it has everything starting from your planning and the work that you're going to do, sprints if you're running Scrum or Agile, boards if you're running Kanban. You can link all of that work into changes that are happening into your repository, which you can then use to define test plans against those specific work items. And then all of that, when you're running pipelines, you have the ability to link those test plans and those work items into individual builds and into individual releases, so that in a normal project, and I don't have all those other pieces set up here, in a normal project, I would be able to come in here and I would be able to see what code was affected by this build. And I would be able to see I could go look at a release and say, okay, this release, what software actually went out in this, and I don't have all of this enabled in this particular environment, but I'd be able to see like what user stories have been deployed, which ones haven't been, what tests have been run, which ones haven't been. So the tooling here is just much more mature than what's available on GitHub. GitHub Actions, I think, launched initially last year, was in beta prior to that, and that's really the first major chunk that allows you to start doing pipelines and stuff in GitHub. Otherwise, what you have to do with GitHub is you either have to bring it into Azure DevOps, or you have to run it through external CI tools, and other things there that I think Azure DevOps is a self-contained entity, probably is right up there with any of the others in the market today. Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us today. I think we're going to end it here. I do apologize again for some of the network issues we've had, but hopefully you took something away from today's talk, and hopefully you'll join us again for another one of our Friday Lunch and Learns. Thank you very much.